There are some love stories that don't explode with fireworks, they don't sweep you off your feet with grand gestures or melodramatic speeches, they just sit there quietly in the corner of your chest, like a knot you can't untangle, like a word that never quite leaves your mouth. And Cinta yang tertahan is exactly that kind of story, a film that doesn't try to impress you with big twists as much as it tries to sit beside you in the dark and say, look, this is what silent heartbreak really looks like. From its very first frame it doesn't scream for your attention, it whispers, and if you've ever stayed in a relationship that felt like you were the only one still breathing life into it, you're going to feel this one in uncomfortable, intimate ways, because this 2025 Indonesian romance drama takes that familiar cliché of a failing marriage and quietly twists it, not into a soap opera, but into a slow-burning autopsy of a love that never had the chance to even be born properly. Before we continue, please subscribe to my channel, Bongo Gaming, and let us know where you are listening from in the comments. Now, picture this, the film opens on a kitchen that feels too big for the two people moving in it, early morning light leaking through the curtains in muted blue-gray, casting long shadows on unwashed dishes and a half-finished cup of coffee, and we see Aurel, her hair tied back in that messy, practical way that tells you she stopped dressing for anyone else a long time ago, moving almost silently between the stove and the small dining table, putting down a plate of toast and eggs in front of a man who barely looks up from his phone. This is John Fuso, her husband of 3 years, and the first thing you notice about him is not that he's cruel, not that he's loud, but that he's absent, present in body but somewhere else entirely in mind, the kind of man who says, thank you, automatically without ever making eye contact, who eats mechanically, who scrolls through emails while his wife watches him like she's hoping to be noticed and already knows she won't be. The film doesn't tell you straight away that they've been married for 3 years, it lets you feel those 3 years in the silence between them, in the way she knows exactly how he takes his coffee without asking, in the way he reaches for his tie on the back of the chair and she's already stepped aside to avoid bumping into him. There's a brilliant, almost cruel economy in these opening minutes, no exposition dump, no voiceover telling you, she has tried for 3 years to warm his heart, but you sense it instinctively as the camera lingers on Aurel's face when John walks out the door with a half-hearted, I'll be late tonight, and she smiles and nods as if she believes him, then that smile falls the second the door clicks shut, replaced by a kind of blankness that's somehow more painful than outright sobbing. One of the first things that Cinta yang tertahan gets so right is this understanding that marriages don't usually fall apart with yelling and broken plates, often they just freeze, day by day, until someone realizes they're the only one still trying to generate warmth, and the film rests its entire emotional core on Aurel's shoulders as she tries and tries and tries to defrost a man whose heart is stuck somewhere else. The title itself, Cinta yang tertahan, literally, love that is held back, or love that is restrained, is like a thesis statement for every frame. This is a story about love that refuses to move, that gets stuck between intention and action, and we watch it through the lens of someone who has spent 3 years believing that consistency and kindness will eventually melt a wall that wasn't built for her in the first place. As the film moves from that opening morning into its first act, we start to piece together their history not through clunky flashbacks, but through objects and small conversations. There's a framed wedding photo on the wall where Aurel is beaming, eyes full of foolish hope, while John smiles politely, almost like a man posing for a stranger. There's a shot of her ironing his shirts while she replays old voice notes on her phone from when they were first arranged to meet, when his tone was stiff but still a little curious. There's a scene where she sits with her mother on the phone and defends him, saying, he's just busy, Ma, that's all, even though we've already seen him ignore her texts to sit alone in the car, staring at an old, worn-out photograph folded so many times the edges are fraying. That photograph is our first tangible glimpse of the ghost in their relationship, John's first love. The movie is too patient to reveal her outright at first, but we see her in fragments, the way Aurel does. She notices the photo one evening when she's picking up his jacket from the couch. The camera doesn't show us the woman's full face, just a profile, a laugh captured mid-moment, hair blown sideways by the wind, hand reaching toward the lens as if to stop whoever's taking the photo. Aurel pauses, fingers lingering a little too long on the image before she gently folds the wallet closed and puts it back where she found it. That pause says everything. In that moment, you don't need narration to tell you that Aurel knows this woman is important and that she will never be that person. The cinematography, restrained but precise, keeps placing Oral on one side of the frame and empty spaces on the other, or places John in focus while she's slightly blurred in the background, visually reinforcing what the story is quietly drilling into us. She's there, always there, but never quite included in his world. What's fascinating about how the film handles John is that it resists the easy temptation to turn him into a cartoon villain. He's cold, yes. He's distant. He's at times brutally indifferent. But we're also given tiny hints that he's broken in his own way, still tethered to someone in his past, someone he believes he lost forever, and in that fixation he fails to see the living, breathing woman making him breakfast every morning. There's a scene relatively early on where John comes home late, his shirt slightly wrinkled, tie loosened, the usual signs of a long day at the office, and Oral has kept dinner warm far too long. The food looks tired, the soup film has formed a skin, the rice is drying out, but she still rushes to the kitchen when she hears the gate open. "You haven't eaten, right?" she asks, that small, hopeful lilt in her voice, and he responds with a detached, "I grabbed something at the office, don't wait up next time." No malice, just practicality. That's what almost makes it worse. She laughs it off, says, "Oh, okay, I'll remember," but the camera cuts to her scraping the untouched food into the trash later, the sound of the rice hitting the bin louder than it needs to be, and you just sit there feeling how demoralizing it must be to constantly adjust yourself to someone who never seems to notice your effort. The movie is obsessed with these small humiliations, these daily deaths of hope, and to some viewers this slow pacing will feel excruciating, maybe even boring, but for others, especially those who have lived through similar situations, it feels brutally honest. As the first act unfolds, we slowly get more explicit hints about John's first love. His colleague at the office teases him about the legend, the girl he was supposed to marry before everything went wrong, and John shuts it down quickly, saying, "That was a long time ago," but the way his eyes flicker tells another story. At home, Oral overhears his mother on the phone reminiscing about that sweet girl from John's college days, and there's a tension in the way Oral listens while pretending to scroll through her phone, that quiet dread of realizing you came into someone's life as a substitute, a safe choice, maybe even a compromise. And then, after all this build-up, after we've marinated in this uneasy domestic limbo for enough time that we're almost begging the story to move, she returns. John's first love. Her name is revealed in the most unceremonious, almost anticlimactic way, which is what makes it feel so real. John is at his office, in yet another long, grey day filled with spreadsheets and meetings, when his assistant comes in looking flustered. "There's someone asking to see you, sir," she says, and when he dismisses it with a distracted, "Tell them to make an appointment," the assistant adds, nervously, "She said her name is Naya." The camera stays close on John's face as that name lands, and for the first time in the whole film up to that point, his mask actually cracks. His fingers freeze over the keyboard, his breath catches, and there's this micro-expression, shock, pain, maybe even a flash of anger, that gives you the sense that this is a wound he thought he'd buried. We cut to the lobby, and there she is, Naya, the first love, standing in soft natural light, dressed simply but with a confidence that contrasts sharply with Oral's quiet, self-effacing presence. The film doesn't frame Naya as a villain either, and that's one of its boldest choices. She's not the seductress who swoops in to destroy a marriage, she's just a woman with her own story, her own grief, and we slowly begin to understand why John has never been fully present. In their first conversation, sitting awkwardly across from each other in a corporate meeting room that suddenly feels too small for the years of history between them, Naya apologizes for disappearing. She talks about moving abroad, about a family crisis, about the frantic decision that made her cut off contact, and as she speaks, we see flashes, not full sequences, just brief shards of memory, of their younger days. Him pushing her on a motorcycle through Jakarta traffic, them sharing cheap food under a leaking warung roof during the rain, her scribbling doodles on his hand during a boring lecture. The film is almost cruel in how tender these glimpses are, because it makes you feel the weight of what John believes he lost, and by extension, why he has never really tried to love Oral. From a purely narrative point of view, this is the moment that could have turned the film into a cliché love triangle, but instead the director chooses a more introspective, slower burn. John doesn't immediately cheat. He doesn't run away with Naya in a blaze of selfish passion. Instead, he recoils. He becomes even more distant at home, more robotic, like seeing Naya has ripped open something he spent years suppressing, and he doesn't know what to do with the flood. Oral feels this shift right away, even if she doesn't know the cause. There's a haunting dinner scene where she tries to tell him about something mundane, a funny thing their neighbor's kid did, a minor incident at the supermarket, and he's there physically, nodding at the right moments, but his eyes are far away, replaying that conversation with Naya. The editing cleverly cuts between Oral at the table talking and the flash of Naya laughing in the office, like John's mind is two places at once, and you start to realize that Oral isn't just competing with another woman in the present, she's competing with the version of John that exists only in his own nostalgia, a version of himself who was in love, who was hopeful, who believed in a future that never happened. Inevitably, the truth surfaces. Oral finds out about Naya, and the film chooses a refreshingly understated way to handle that revelation. It's not through a dramatic confrontation or a caught-in-the-act moment, it's through a hospital corridor. The hospital is not just a future location where she will sign a divorce paper, it's an ever-present metaphor for a love that is technically alive but constantly on life support. The story eventually confirms what we've suspected: John has reconnected with Naya, not in a romantic whirlwind, but in a series of awkward, heavy conversations where they both try to process the what-ifs of their past. Naya, to her credit, is not here to steal him. In fact, she tells him plainly that she knows he's married, that she respects that. But she also admits she wanted to see for herself whether he's happy, perhaps to ease her own guilt. In one emotionally loaded scene in a quiet cafe, Naya asks him directly, "Do you love your wife?" and John's silence is louder than any answer. He doesn't say no. He doesn't say yes. He just looks away, his jaw clenched, and the film lets that non-answer hang between them. This, in many ways, is the cruel heart of the story, not an affair, not a betrayal of bodies, but a betrayal of absence, of withheld affection, of unspoken truths. When Oral eventually stumbles upon evidence of Naya's return, a message on his phone, a small sketch folded into his notebook, something that only someone who knew him deeply would draw, the film builds to what we might expect to be the big confrontation. But again, instead of shouting, we get quiet devastation. That night, she waits for him in the living room, an envelope on the table in front of her, the only sound the ticking of the wall clock and a distant motorcycle passing outside. When John comes in, surprised to see her still awake, she doesn't scream, she doesn't throw the phone at him, she just looks at him with eyes that seem almost emptied out and asks, "John, if she hadn't left you back then, would you still have married me?" It's such a simple question, and in that moment, everything stops. John, for once, has to confront the thing he's been ducking for 3 years. The camera stays painfully still on his face as he processes the question, and we can see the battle inside him, the urge to lie to protect her, to say, "Of course I would," versus the weight of his own inability to fully commit to that lie. He takes too long to answer. That's his answer. Oral gives a small, tragic smile, nodding like she expected it, and in that microsecond, you can see something in her break and reset, like a bone that's finally given up resisting the fracture. And then, instead of pressing further, she slides the envelope across the table toward him. He looks at it, confused, and opens it to reveal what we, as an audience, probably didn't expect to see this early in the movie: divorce papers. Not from him. From her. She has beaten him to it. The film flips the script on that tired trope where the emotionally unavailable husband is the one who finally decides to end things when true love returns. Instead, it's the wife, the woman who has been trying to warm his heart for 3 years, who chooses to let go. But even in this, there's no big monologue. Her words are small, almost matter-of-fact. "You don't have to feel guilty, John. You gave me a house. You gave me your name. But you never gave me your heart. And I'm tired of asking for something you don't know how to give." It's understated, but it hits like a gut punch. He reacts with the same frosty composure that has defined him so far. He stares at the papers, clenches his jaw, and says simply, "If that's what you want," as if this is just another administrative decision, like signing a work contract. He doesn't argue. He doesn't fight for her. He doesn't even ask, "Can we try again?" And that might be the most devastating part for Oral, not the fact of the divorce, but the ease with which he accepts it. The next sequence is what the film will likely be remembered for, the one that people will clip and share with subtitles across social media. Oral lying in a hospital bed, pale but eerily calm, signing the divorce papers with a hand that trembles not from physical weakness alone, but from the emotional finality of the act. The timeline has now caught up with those earlier flashes. We learn that shortly after that living room conversation, Oral collapsed at work, exhaustion, stress, a pre-existing heart condition that she'd been quietly managing without making it a big deal, because she didn't want to bother her already distant husband, and was taken to the hospital. John, informed by a colleague, rushed there, but by the time he arrived, she had already made up her mind. There's this haunting shot of him standing in the doorway of her room, half in shadow, watching as the nurse hands her the pen and the clipboard. The camera stays on his hand gripping the door frame so tightly his knuckles go white, and only then do we get something like a crack in his icy facade. He doesn't speak. He doesn't stop her. It's almost like he believes he doesn't have the right. A nurse glances over at him, sensing the tension, but says nothing, because, as far as she knows, this is just a normal legal process. Oral doesn't even look up as she signs, her eyes fixed on the paper, the sound of the pen scratching across the signature line amplified in the sound mix, echoing like a knife being drawn. When she finishes, she exhales, a tiny, shaky breath that sounds almost like a release, and only then does she turn slightly, enough to see John's silhouette in the doorway. Their eyes meet for a fleeting second, and there's a world in that gaze, disappointment, relief, sorrow, love that never fully bloomed. And then she looks away. That turn of her head is one of the most powerful performances in the film. There's no dialogue, but you can feel the entire weight of her decision in that small movement. This hospital scene is also where the film's thematic threads come together. Throughout, we've seen Oral's love as something soft, pliable, almost self-sacrificial, but here it hardens into something else, self-respect. Signing those papers while physically weak, hooked to 4 lines, is the visual metaphor for a woman who has given everything and finally chooses to save herself, even if that salvation comes with pain. John's reaction afterward is a study in repressed emotion. He walks down the corridor, the document now officially processed, and in one quiet moment by the vending machine he finally lets out a strangled, half-formed sob, not loud enough for anyone to hear, but enough for the audience to understand that beneath that cold exterior, he is finally feeling the consequences of his own restraint. It's here, ironically, that his love for Oral, Tertahan, all this time, starts to surface, too late. The second half of Cinta Young Tertahan could have easily turned into a redemption arc where John fights to win her back, but the film is more honest than that. It recognizes that there are some doors you can't just decide to walk back through once you've ignored them for too long. Instead, it shifts focus more closely onto Oral's journey after the divorce, the quiet rebuilding of a life that had, for 3 years, revolved around someone who barely orbited her. We see her move out of their house with the help of a friend, packing her modest belongings into cardboard boxes. There's a moment where she stands in their now empty bedroom, looking at the dent in the pillow where his head used to rest, and she runs her fingers across it one last time before turning away. If the first half of the film is dominated by cool, desaturated colors and tight, claustrophobic framing, the second half begins to introduce more natural light, though still tinged with melancholy. Oral finds a small apartment closer to her office, a cramped but sunny space where she can finally arrange things the way she likes without wondering if he will approve. There's a strangely liberating scene where she buys plants for the first time, joking to the shop owner that she's terrible at keeping them alive, and we understand this is about more than just greenery. It's about her cautiously testing whether she can nurture something and have it actually respond. The first half is dominated by cool tones, lots of blue, gray, and washed-out daylight, emphasizing the emotional coldness of Oral and John's marriage. Hospital scenes, interestingly, are not the usual sterile white but tinged with a faint green, giving them a sickly, limbo-like feel. After the divorce, as Oral begins to reclaim her life, we start seeing warmer hues creep into the frame, golden light streaming into her small apartment during sunset, the earthy tones of the plants she tends to, even the soft pastel of the notebook she starts writing in as she processes her feelings. It's not an in-your-face transformation, it's gradual, like your eyes adjusting to light after coming out of a tunnel. The score is another understated but powerful component. Instead of swelling orchestral themes, we get a minimalist blend of piano, subtle strings, and occasional traditional Indonesian instrumentation, like a soft gamelan line echoing in moments of reflection. One recurring musical motif is a simple four-note piano phrase that plays whenever Aurel tries, in vain, to connect with John, over breakfast, at the dinner table, waiting for him to answer a question and being met with silence. After the divorce, that same phrase reappears, but slightly reharmonized, now suggesting not yearning but acceptance. It's a small detail, but for attentive listeners, it adds a layer of emotional continuity that deepens the impact. Pacing-wise, Cinta yang tertahan is deliberately slow, and this will be a point of contention for many viewers. If you're used to fast-cut editing, constant plot twists, and dialogue-heavy scenes, this film will feel like watching fog roll in. It takes its time, often lingering on silences, on the spaces between what people say and what they mean. But that slowness is precisely what makes the emotional beats land so hard, because by the time Aurel signs those divorce papers, you haven't just watched a story, you've lived inside that suffocating marriage with her. The repetition of their daily routines, the subtle variations in how she sets the table or how he comes home late, these tiny echoes build a rhythm that makes the rupture feel both inevitable and devastating. Thematically, the film is rich without being preachy. At its core, it's about emotional neglect and the quiet violence of indifference, about how love isn't just about not cheating or not shouting, but about showing up, about being emotionally present. It critiques the cultural narrative that a woman's patience can fix a man, that if she just loves him hard enough, he will eventually come around. Aurel's arc explicitly rejects that trope. Her growth doesn't come from winning his love, but from choosing herself after realizing that his heart is frozen in a past she can never compete with. It also touches, quite poignantly, on the subject of divorce stigma, especially in a more traditional context. Early in the film, Aurel's mother warns her, "Persorian itu abe, divorce is a shame," and you can see how deeply that fear sits in Aurel's bones. Part of why she stays so long, why she keeps trying, is because she doesn't want to be the woman who couldn't keep her husband. By the end, though, the act of signing those papers in front of strangers in a hospital is reframed not as a shameful failure, but as a brave step toward reclaiming her dignity. The film doesn't romanticize this decision. It's still painful, still lonely, but it frames it as necessary, and that's a quietly radical message in a cultural landscape where women are often encouraged to endure endlessly. Another significant theme is timing and the cruel way life doesn't always align people's readiness to love. John and Naya had their chance and lost it, not entirely by choice, and they've both been orbiting that absence ever since. John and Aurel, meanwhile, had a legally sanctioned relationship without an emotional foundation, and we watch the tragic mismatch of one person arriving with an open heart while the other is still stuck grieving an idealized past. In that sense, Cinta yang tertahan becomes less a love story and more a study of misaligned timelines, what happens when you meet the right person at the wrong time, or when you meet someone willing to love you but you haven't yet made peace with who you were before them. One of the most quietly devastating lines in the film comes in the second half, when John, finally mustering the courage to visit Aurel after the divorce papers are processed, finds her sitting alone on a bench outside the hospital. He sits beside her, leaving a respectful distance, and after a long silence he says, I think I was afraid to love you because it would mean admitting that what I lost with her wasn't the only love I'd ever get." It's a raw confession, and for a moment, you might hope this will open a door, that maybe this is the beginning of reconciliation. But Aurel just looks at him, tears in her eyes, and replies, "You years too late, John." There's no melodramatic sting, no music swell, just that simple statement, and in it lies the film's understanding that some apologies, no matter how sincere, can't undo the accumulation of unspoken hurts. The broader cultural impact of a film like this, especially released in 2025, is interesting to speculate about. In a cinematic landscape often dominated by more sensational love triangles and comedic infidelities, a story that focuses so intensely on the quiet, interior suffering of a neglected wife feels almost subversive. Audiences who have grown up on stories where true love excuses all kinds of bad behavior might find themselves uncomfortably confronted by John, who is not a monster, not abusive in the overt sense, but whose apathy destroys a woman's spirit just as effectively. Many viewers, especially women, will likely see themselves in Aurel, in the endless justifications, the late-night Googling of how to make your husband love you, the mental gymnastics of blaming yourself for someone else's emotional walls. The film seems tailor-made for post-viewing discussions, for long comment threads where people share their own experiences with one-sided relationships, the echoing question of, how long is too long to stay? Already, you can imagine certain dialogues becoming quote fodder online. Oral's, you gave me a house, you gave me your name, but you never gave me your heart, or her quietly defiant, you don't have to apologize for what he couldn't give me, or that haunting, final bench conversation where she tells him he's too late. These lines have the compact, shareable quality of memes, but instead of cheap sentimentality, they carry the weight of scenes we've deeply felt. The cinematography starts using wider shots, giving her literal space on the screen, and the camera, which earlier would often keep her slightly out of focus behind John, now stays with her, following her routines, her small moments of joy and relapse into sorrow. Meanwhile, John is left in the echo of the life he took for granted. Alone in the now half-empty house, he wanders from room to room like a ghost, noticing small details he never saw before, the way she labeled the jars in the kitchen in her neat handwriting, the little notes she used to leave on the fridge, some still stuck there, edges curling, reminding him to eat, to rest, to call his mother. There's a particularly heartbreaking scene where he finds a box under the bed containing letters she wrote but never gave him, apologies for arguments that never even happened out loud, confessions of her fear that she wasn't enough, promises to try harder, to be the wife he deserved. He sits on the floor, reading them one by one, and for the first time we see real, unguarded tears streaming down his face. This is, in some ways, the film's reckoning with the theme of unspoken emotion. He is now overwhelmed by the words she held back out of fear of burdening him, just as he held back words of affection out of his own unresolved grief for Naya. The story doesn't vilify Naya, and in the post-divorce stretch we actually get one of the most mature scenes in the film, an encounter between Oral and Naya. They meet, not through some orchestrated dramatic showdown, but by chance, at a charity event that both their workplaces support. Oral doesn't recognize her at first, but Naya recognizes Oral from a photo she'd glimpsed on John's phone. The moment realization hits, there's a taut silence. You almost expect jealousy, accusation, maybe even a slap. This is melodrama territory, after all, but instead, what we get is two women standing on opposite sides of a man's emotional failure, talking to each other with a hesitant, aching honesty. Naya, visibly nervous, introduces herself. Oral takes a moment, processes the name, and you can see that click behind her eyes. There's a long beat where she could walk away, but she doesn't. Instead, she gestures to a quiet corner where they sit with paper cups of lukewarm coffee, and Naya says, softly, I'm sorry. Oral, visibly tired of carrying blame for things she didn't cause, responds with something that feels like the emotional thesis of the movie, you don't have to apologize for what he couldn't give me. It's such a quietly powerful line, because it shifts the focus away from the old narrative of other woman versus wife, and centers the real issue, John's inability to fully commit, his failure to confront his own heart. The conversation that follows is one of mutual recognition. Naya admits she once thought she was the only woman he'd ever love, but life tore them apart. Oral admits she spent 3 years trying to become someone he could love, only to realize that love doesn't grow on effort alone, it needs genuine willingness, reciprocity. They both, in their own ways, cared for John deeply, and both suffered under his inability to emotionally show up. By the end of the conversation, there's no newfound friendship, no warm embrace, but there's a kind of truce, a shared understanding that they are not enemies, just two lives intersecting on the fault line of a man's unresolved past. Cinematically, this scene is shot with a simple, steady camera, no dramatic music, just a low ambient hum, allowing the performances to carry the weight. It's a rare, refreshing moment in a genre that often thrives on catfights and caricatures, and it's one of the reasons this film leaves such a lingering aftertaste. It's more interested in emotional truth than in easy drama. The performances across the board serve this intention beautifully. The actress playing Oral gives a layered, humane portrayal of a woman who moves from self-effacing hope to quiet self-preservation. Her face is expressive even when she's not speaking, and some of the most affecting moments are just close-ups of her listening, to John, to his mother, to her own doubts, while trying not to let her reaction spill over. You can see the precise moment when hope dims but doesn't fully die, the micro-expressions of someone rationalizing yet another disappointment with, maybe tomorrow will be better. By the time she's in that hospital bed signing away her marriage, The transformation is subtle but profound. It's not that she's become hardened or bitter, but she's grounded now in a clearer understanding of her own worth. The actor playing John has the tricky task of making a cold, emotionally constipated man watchable, even sympathetic, and he mostly succeeds by leaning into restraint without turning robotic. Early on, his stillness reads as arrogance, but as we get those small glimpses into his inner turmoil, the way his hand shakes slightly when he first learns Naya is back, the flicker of pain when Oral asks that devastating, "Would you have married me?" question, you begin to see a man who has trapped himself in an emotional holding pattern, terrified of moving forward and dictionarying his past, yet too cowardly to admit it. It doesn't excuse his behavior, but it humanizes it, and the film is better for that nuance. Naya, as a character, could have easily been a plot device, but the actress gives her depth. She's neither saint nor homewrecker, just a wounded person trying to reconcile her younger self with the choices she made. In their scenes together, John and Naya share a charged history that feels lived in, which makes it all the more painful that the love that once defined them now exists mostly as a question mark. Technically, the film leans into a grounded, almost minimalist approach. The cinematography tends to favor naturalistic lighting, using lots of window light, reflections, and shadows to mirror the characters' emotional states. One motif that stands out is the use of glass, windows, mirrors, car windshields, often positioning characters on opposite sides of a reflective surface, suggesting distance and introspection at the same time. There's a scene late in the film where John stands outside Oral's new apartment building, watching her from across the street through a rain-speckled window as she laughs with a group of co-workers. The glass between them becomes almost symbolic of everything unsaid and undone, and the way the camera lingers on his reflection overlapping with her image inside the room says more than any confrontation could. The color grading, too, tells its own quiet story. Sometimes a love story doesn't break your heart so much as it loosens something knotted deep inside it, and Cinta tertahan, released in 2025, is exactly that kind of film, a quiet storm that rolls in without spectacle, just the low rumble of truth arriving, one soft wave of realization at a time, until you realize you've been holding your breath for 2 hours, and when the credits finally come you're not sure if you've been healed or hollowed or both, and as a reviewer who's seen too many romances intoxicated with chasing the flame, I was disarmed by how fiercely this one respects the choice to walk away. Before we continue, please subscribe to my channel Bongo Gaming, and let us know where you are listening from in the comments, because for a film that turns the margins of love into the main text, it matters where we're watching from, it matters what kind of silence we carry into the theater, what kind of prayer, what kind of hurt, and it matters to hear the places this story meets you, whether you're in Jakarta or Jogja, Kuala Lumpur or Melbourne, whether you're watching near midnight when the apartment is quiet and the phone is face down, or on a bus ride while the city blurs past, because this is a film that asks you to bring yourself the way Oral brings herself, not with self-dramatizing grief but with the humblest kind of bravery, the kind that says I tried and I still could not warm the cold inside the person I loved, I still could not coax a winter into spring, and when the person he once loved returned to his orbit like an old planet pulling tide, all I got was a sheet of paper that turned our house into a waiting room, our bed into a hallway, our days into the pause between sentences, and in the end, laid out in a hospital bed with the world slowed to a machine-steady beep, I scrawled my name and freed the both of us, and if you think I'm spoiling the whole movie, I promise I'm not, because Cinta tertahan isn't about surprise, it's about recognition, about sitting with moments we've known in our own lives and daring to look at them straight on, and just as the title translates loosely to love, held back, the film itself holds back its melodrama until the restraint becomes the point, an exercise in feeling the burn of words that never arrive and warmth that never arrives and the kind of endurance that shouldn't be asked of anyone but often is, especially of women, especially in homes where love and duty are constantly braided together like thread and rope. When I say released in 2025, I don't want to clutter you with production trivia or speculative gossip about how long the shoot lasted or who was attached first, because Cinta tertahan doesn't invite that kind of chatter. It asks for a different gaze, a simpler one, a gaze that pays attention to texture, to breath, to small domestic rituals that become a couple's secret language or its secret prison, and in this way the release itself feels timely, arriving into a moment where conversations about marriage, obligation, and self-worth are not news but still feel taboo when held in the light, a moment when audiences are ready to sit longer with the grey in between love's beginnings and endings, to examine the limbo of years 3 and 4 and 5 from the inside. And the film's minimalist approach to background detail says it all. We don't know the street names where this couple lives. We don't know the exact hospital ward or the brand of the coffee they prefer. We don't know which icons hang on their walls. We don't even really know what everyone around them thinks, because the point is how an ordinary home becomes a weather system when love, withheld, sits like fog on the windows, and how one person's refusal to thaw is sometimes the fiercest form of cruelty precisely because it's soft and deniable, precise because there is no scream to point at, no slap to photograph. Only a pattern of silence is so consistent they form a kind of architecture. The story overview, then, can be written in the simplest lines, though simplicity here has weight. Visual moments, too, seem destined to be screenshot and shared, Oral scraping a carefully cooked meal into the trash, her fingers hovering over the divorce paper before signing, John sitting on the floor with a box of unsent letters, Nia and Oral facing each other in that coffee corner, both carrying different pieces of the same puzzle. One could imagine the film sparking debates around what constitutes enough reason to leave a marriage. Is emotional neglect, without physical violence or infidelity, grounds for divorce? The film seems to answer a firm yes, but it does so without demonizing the person who fails to show up. Instead, it paints a complex picture where trauma, nostalgia, and fear all conspire to produce harmful patterns. This complexity might frustrate viewers who prefer clear-cut villains and heroes, but it's precisely what gives the story resonance. In terms of its place in Indonesian cinema, Cinta yang tertahan feels like part of a broader trend towards more introspective, character-driven dramas that tackle difficult emotional terrain without relying on melodramatic extremes. It's not trying to be flashy, its power lies in recognition, in the way it mirrors everyday heartbreak. One of the smartest decisions the filmmakers make is the ending. Without spoiling every detail, it avoids a neat resolution. We don't end with Oral suddenly in a new, perfect relationship. That would feel too easy, too much like saying, see, all that pain was worth it because she gets a better man. Instead, we end with her in a place of quiet possibility. She's not fixed, she's not over everything, but she's moving, literally and metaphorically. There's a scene, close to the final moments, where she takes a solo trip to the beach, a location we've previously only seen in flashbacks of John and Nia's youthful romance. The beach for them was a symbol of first love. For Oral, it becomes a symbol of self-discovery. Standing alone on the shore, hair whipped by the wind, she doesn't throw her wedding ring into the ocean in some grand symbolic gesture. Instead, we see that she's already stopped wearing it. She just stands there, feeling the sand under her feet, breathing deeply, watching the waves crash and recede. The camera slowly pulls back, making her smaller in the frame, but paradoxically, she feels larger as a person, more complete in her solitude than she ever did in that big, cold house with John. John's final scenes, by contrast, are not ones of complete despair, but of belated reflection. We see him sitting in his car outside his old home, now occupied by strangers, glancing at the porch where Oral used to wait for him, then driving away without getting out. We see him visiting his parents, listening for once to his mother's stories about his childhood, perhaps trying to understand where his patterns of emotional avoidance began. There's a short, wordless moment where he scrolls through his phone, hovers over Oral's contact, and then puts the phone down, as if finally respecting her decision to build a life without him. It's not a dramatic transformation, but it's a hint that he may, in his own slow, stumbling way, begin to change, not to win her back, but to become someone who won't repeat the same mistake if life ever offers him another chance at love. By the time the credits roll, you're left with a complex swirl of feelings, sadness for what could have been, admiration for Oral's strength, frustration at John's inertia, empathy for Nia's position, and maybe, if you've lived even a little through something similar, a sense of being seen. This isn't a film that will satisfy viewers looking for escapism, it's too grounded, too emotionally raw. But for those who are willing to sit with its silences, to lean into its slow rhythm, it offers a deeply cathartic experience. As a long-form cinematic experience, it trusts you to reflect, to fill in the gaps with your own experiences, rather than spoon-feeding moral lessons. Watching Cinta yang tertahan feels, in many ways, like reading a diary you weren't supposed to see, intimate, sometimes uncomfortably close, but undeniably human. And that, I think, is why this story lingers. We live in a world that loves declarations of grand passion, that glorifies the chase, the confession, the big kiss in the rain, but this film reminds us that some of the most consequential moments in love happen in much smaller, quieter ways, in the decision to stop trying, in the signing of a paper on a hospital bed, in the simple act of walking away from a door that will finally, irrevocably, close behind you. So if you've ever looked across a table at someone you're supposed to love and thought, "You're here, but you're not with me," this movie might feel like looking into a mirror you weren't quite ready for. And maybe that's the question it ultimately leaves you with: how many of us are living in loves that are tertahan, restrained, held back, frozen by fear or nostalgia or pride, and how many of us are brave enough, like Oral, to finally let go, even when it means facing the world alone for a while? I'll leave you sitting with that thought, and with one more question that this film quietly plants in your heart without ever saying it out loud. Oral and John Fuso have been married for 3 years, a number that in this film feels both brief and eternal, long enough to develop rituals, short enough that those rituals haven't become invisible, and across those years Oral tries, sincerely and without spectacle, to reach the person she promised a life to. We sense that previous chapters exist, that there were light-hearted beginnings and a promise made in faith. But by the time the film opens, the temperature has dropped, and the color palette mirrors this: warm light puddles in certain corners and leaves others cool to the touch, the camera never insisting but always noticing, and John is present like an outline, a man of few words, not cruel in any pointed way, not dangerous, but a person whose interior winter has never learned how to seek the sun. Then a tremor in this fragile routine arrives in the form of a first love returning to his orbit. And we're careful here because the film is careful. There is no cheap villainy. In the homecoming of this old love, only the awkward resurface of a self he once was, the embers of a path not taken flaring into hypothetical heat, and that's when something formal lands in Oral's hands, the machine language of a divorce petition, which in its phrasing and indifference seems hell-bent on flattening all the life they've lived together into a checkbox and a stamp, and still the film refuses to flail. It refuses big fights or thrown plates, instead it watches Oral hold the page like it's fragile enough to cut her fingers, and this is where Cinta Young Tertahan distinguishes itself, by making paperwork a character, making signatures a love language turn to its negative, and from there we move not towards combat but towards an unraveling that feels like a series of quiet rehearsals for letting go, Oral choosing space over bargaining, choosing clarity over hope's stubborn denial, and by the time the hospital bed arrives the film has earned the gravity of the pen in her hand. The brilliance of this approach rests not in the what but in the how, and as a narrative voice I'm aware how easy it is to turn a review into a plot autopsy, but that would be a betrayal here. I want you to sit with Oral in the kitchen as steam lifts from a bowl of rice and the spoon becomes a metronome and the shuffling of slippers from the next room tells her more than words would. I want you to stand beside her in the supermarket aisle, reading labels as if they are poems, trying to guess which taste might bridge the distance between two people, and I want you to step into John's quiet, not to absolve him but to see him as the film sees him, not as a villain but as a person whose fear of being alive with another person has calcified into habit, a man who might prefer the idea of love to its practice, who might think of fidelity as straight lines and forget that intimacy is a field you must walk every day even in the rain, especially in the rain. If you're waiting for plot swerves, Cinta Young Tertahan does give you changes, of course it does, like any good story it breathes, but their shape is elliptical. The film has a way of returning to the same rooms from slightly different angles, letting you notice what moved on the shelf, what's missing from the desk, what photo frame now holds a different picture, and in this way change is rendered as a kind of time-lapse of the soul, events eddy rather than crash, and so when the first love appears we sense not a narrative bomb but a truth serum, a presence that strips away whatever illusions lived in the house, and Oral's acceptance of the papers isn't resignation, not in the defeatist sense, it's a vote for reality, it's a declaration that love cannot be performed alone, that love as a collective verb requires two subjects who show up, and there's a tiny moment in the film where her hand hovers over the form before she signs, and you can read everything in that hover, the weight of family expectations, the soft tyranny of being called patient and kind as if endurance were a moral end in itself, and the longing to be seen as alive and not just good. What's elegant about the film's character design is that Oral and John aren't chess pieces in an argument about marriage, they're people in a room, and the actors playing them move with an economy that tells you the director trusts your intelligence. There are no explanatory monologues, no blatant declarations of, "This is who I am." Instead there are eyes and pauses and the way a shoulder settles when a voice reaches the right tone. And from those details you build your understanding, brick by brick, heartbeat by heartbeat. Oral, especially, is a marvel of quiet complexity. We read her not as saint or martyr but as someone who has loved fully and now understands the paradox that love at its most mature sometimes asks you to step away to preserve what is true inside you, and John's stillness becomes a mirror, and sometimes a killing frost, a representation of all the men who were taught the music of duty but never learned to hum the melody of openness, and the film never shames him. But it does hold him accountable, which is rarer on screen than it should be. Cinematically, I was struck by a palette that understands homes both as glow and shadow, that embraces dawn as a place of maybe and dusk as a place of honesty, the way the camera glides through rooms as if reluctant to shake the air too hard, as if silence is a delicate creature it does not want to spook, the way sound design lets you hear the kettle at a distance, the honk of a scooter beyond the window, the wheeled echo of hospital trolleys on polished floors, the beep of machines that mark the heart's rhythm like a small alarm that has nothing to do with romance and everything to do with the cost of staying, and the cost of leaving, and the editing refuses to trim the breath between exchanges, which in some films would read as indulgence. Yes, but here it gives the story permission to be human length, pulse length, the way real conversation often sinks and stutters before finding a through line. There's so much to admire in how the film uses everyday rituals as set pieces, a shirt pressed meticulously to celebrate an anniversary that arrives with no ceremony in return, a phone with a screen filled by a message that will go unsent, a table set with a favorite dish that stays warm under a cloth while a different memory warms in someone else's chest, and I kept thinking, there are fireworks in this film, but they're inverted. They go off inwardly, you see their bloom in a lowered gaze or hands that keep busy cleaning as a way to hold from trembling, and because the film refuses to condescend, it never hands you a villain to safely boo and a hero to easily cheer. It leaves you in love's messy middle, where choice is the climax and compromise is both a tenderness and a trap. What about the hospital, though, the image of Oral signing in a bed? Why does it land with such elemental force, and how does the film get there without feeling manipulative? To answer that I have to talk about the caretaking the film does with time. It interleaves present scenes with the smallest flashbacks or imagined forward glances, but never as exposition dumps, rather as a rhythm like the body's own, an ebb and flow that says of course the hospital is not just a hospital, it's every moment you ignored your body to tend to the body of the relationship, it's every headache pinned to the corkboard of hope, every sleepless night repurposed as proof that you were still trying, and so when the paperwork and the fall line sit in the same frame, the film has made that juxtaposition feel not symbolic but inevitable, as if it was always leading to a moment where living and legal reality would intersect in one signature that is both surrender and self-rescue. Performances matter in stories like this because the danger is passivity, because if the actors simply absorb the film's softness we risk boredom, but here the softness is alive, it's charged with decision, and the actors bring this across in glance work and voice, in the way Oral's tone grows assertive without tipping into bitterness, in the way John's jaw tightens at the mention of the past, not because he's defensive but because he's not practiced in the vocabulary of being known, and the scenes between them never resolve for easy tension because the film knows that resentment is a cousin of restraint and that sometimes what feels like calm is actually the absence of imagination. There is a moment when the first love, unnamed in the script but fully felt, returns as a presence in a scene framed by glass and grey, and in that glass you see reflections of people they once were. The film never tells you what happened years ago. It trusts that you understand how first loves can interrupt the present, and what's generous is that it lets this returning figure be simply human too, not a siren, not a devil, just someone who also has a history, who also wants to be chosen. And this equanimity is part of why Oral's choice later registers not as a reaction to someone else but as an answer to herself. Thematically, Cinta yang tertahan is anchored to two words, permission and temperature, permission for each person to be fully themselves in a partnership and temperature as the metaphor for emotional presence, and the film examines who gets to set the thermostat in a relationship, who is tasked with warming a room that someone else keeps opening the windows of, and so by the end, the notion of leaving becomes not a failure to love but a refusal to be the sole furnace forever, and across cultures but especially in contexts where marriage is treated as the ultimate proof of adulthood, this argument feels bracing and necessary, not as a polemic but as a whisper in the ear of anyone who has confused durability with health. I keep thinking about the cultural context in which this film lands. Because in many communities divorce is still a doorway with too many locks, even as younger generations insist on mental health and mutually reciprocal commitment as non-negotiables. And Cinta Yang Tertahan doesn't throw away tradition, it doesn't mock, but it also doesn't valorize endurance for endurance's sake. It asks, who taught you to hold your breath this long, and what might happen if you let it out? And the audience response I felt in the room when I watched this was not the cheers of a big twist but a kind of collective exhale, a sound you can't fake, the sound of bodies recognizing language they didn't know they spoke. And later, in conversations outside the theater, I heard people tell small, trembling stories about their own kitchens, their own forms, their own letters they never sent. I heard people defend John and I heard people defend oral, and the film might be at its most beautiful when it allows for both, when it proves that empathy and accountability are not enemies. Pacing is often the first thing people ask me about when I recommend slow burn dramas, and yes, this film is measured, and yes, it favors accumulation over escalation, but it's never inert. The slowness here is a method. It allows a layered reading of everyday moments, lets you watch a pattern form and then break, so by the time the major beats arrive you believe them with your whole body. And halfway through I realized that the film had tuned my attention to a finer pitch. I found myself studying the tablecloth like a map. I found myself knowing which corner of the sofa John sits on. I knew which cup Oral prefers when she needs to feel steadier, and that kind of minute attention is a gift. It's the thing that makes art feel like a mirror because it proves the film is paying attention the way you wish your partner would, and that's why it lands like it does when the paper appears, because it's another object in the world touched with that uncanny attention. Some will ask about gender politics here, and the film is wise about it, letting Oral's choice to release become not a performance of empowerment but a private conviction. It guards her from the trap of making the breakup a stage, and it resists the equally damaging trap of making her stay in the name of being more virtuous than the person she loves. And as for John, the film even allows him a path to growth. It allows the possibility that understanding can arrive too late to save one love but early enough to save the next life he lives. And that kind of generosity is rare and brave because it refuses the comfort of total condemnation. Visually the film waltzes between textures, the grain of wood, the coolness of tile, the watery gloss of the hospital corridor, the way the outdoors is rendered as a brief reprieve, crowded streets that offer anonymity and therefore a kind of relief, the way a motorcycle ride can become a sort of therapy, wind like a baptism, and then back inside where rooms become test chambers for the experiment of living together. And it's all orchestrated with a steadiness that suggests craft but never showboating, and the score, too, stays humble, sometimes disappearing entirely, sometimes giving you the hush of plucked strings like a hand at your back, and when it swells it's never to tell you what to feel, it's to hold you through what you already feel, and in this restraint the film finds a new language for heartbreak, one without histrionics. There's a scene, not a spoiler, where Oral stops midway through folding laundry because she hears the rain and steps to the door and just watches, and it's the simplest thing but it made me ache because the camera lingers on her face and in that space you feel 1,000 small deaths and small resurrections, you see the arithmetic of the day recalculating in her eyes, and you understand that heartbreak is not a single event but a tide. And this film studies tides the way a sailor does, waiting for a break in the weather to steer safely to shore. And suddenly I felt not like a viewer but like someone in the house with them, ready to put a pot under a leak, ready to sweep, ready to say the words I wish they could say to each other. If we talk spoilers, well, the summary itself has already told you a lot, but I'd argue it hasn't spoiled the wonder of watching the film get there, because the film's jewelry isn't in the plot stones, it's in the settings around them, in how the light catches on their edges, and the hospital signing is, yes, a kind of end, but it's also a beginning. And though this is not a sequel-baiting narrative, it feels like a door opening to a new season for Oral, a season where her love isn't a room she warms alone, and it even feels like a door for John, though it's a quieter door, one that leads to a hallway where he has to learn to walk without the crutch of someone else's patience, and I think different viewers will carry different endings out with them. Some will imagine reconciliation the film doesn't write, others will imagine solitude as a resting place not a punishment, and that interpretive freedom is the mark of a film that respects you. I don't think it's a coincidence that so many of the film's strongest frames involve doors and windows and thresholds, the architecture of between, because that's where this story lives, and I also don't think it's accidental that the spaces are ordinary. There's no house so beautiful that the viewers feel alien, there's no hospital so gilt that it turns the scene into a music video. And in that ordinary the film finds the nerve to ask extraordinary questions about how we live with each other. Without asking each other to be more than we are, and more importantly how we leave without wishing each other less than we are. And there's a small line Oral says to herself, not a floor-shaking declaration but an almost soundless vow that she will not repeat a pattern she learned in her childhood, that she will not turn into a woman whose joy lives entirely in the permission of someone else's attention. And you feel the personal nestle into the cultural here, because across languages and across cities the lesson is the same. Endurance can be a virtue, but not if the thing you're enduring is the erasure of yourself. On a purely technical level, the film's direction does something subtle with distance, the way it keeps the camera a little back when John is on screen and a little closer when Oral is, a visual grammar that writes the chasm between them as a set of feet and inches rather than just as an idea, and the blocking in certain scenes lets the audience do the math of their proximity. A cushion between them feels like a mountain, a reach for water becomes a metaphor for effort, and whether or not viewers have experienced this exact kind of marriage, they will recognize the choreography of people who no longer know how to dance together and cannot admit it because admission would require a courage they haven't yet named. I was particularly moved by how the film handles community. The world outside the couple is rarely seen in sweeping detail, but when it is, it's to offer perspective. A conversation with a nurse who is gentle enough to be a stranger and strong enough to be a mirror, a shopkeeper who notices that Oral is buying smaller amounts now, a neighbor who says good morning like a prayer, and these small touches keep the story from turning into a tunnel. They keep social weight in the frame, reminding you that heartbreak is not an island, there are ferries connecting it to other terrains, and sometimes those ferries are people you barely know. In terms of audience reaction and cultural impact, Cinta young Tertahan arrives into a region of viewers who don't always see their intimate tragedies staged with this kind of respect, who are used to melodrama or moralizing, and the hush that greeted the ending in the screening I attended felt like a communal liturgy, people sitting very still, people not immediately reaching for their phones as if afraid to break the delicate thing they were just given, and then later online the murmurs gathered, not the usual frenzy of hot takes but something slower and more generous, people recommending it to people they care about, couples who watched it together and then went for a walk under streetlights, daughters sending the title to their mothers, brothers making plans to check on sisters, and an entirely different thread of men who saw themselves in John and either flinched or leaned in, either dismissed the film as too quiet or let its quiet address them, and in that way the movie began to live outside its runtime, a conversation piece, a small mirror in many pockets, a reason to ask someone you love a question you've been afraid to ask: do you feel alone when I am here? I know that some viewers will want more explicit context about why John is the way he is. He is, after all, a composite of many men who were not taught the language of tenderness, men who were permitted to be competent but not porous, and the film resists giving him a diagnostic backstory, and I think that's right because we do not always get to know the reason someone cannot draw near, we only get to live with the fact of it. And the film does not deny that therapy exists, that change is possible. But it also doesn't turn love into a rehabilitation center, it doesn't place on Oral the role of healer she did not consent to carry, and in that refusal is a gift to anyone who has stayed too long in the name of being strong. Does the film get everything perfect? Perhaps the very restraint that grants it grace will irritate some who crave messier catharsis, perhaps the near absence of levity will feel like a missed chance for small laughter to salt the wound and make it human, but for me the humor that does exist is as it should be, small and present tense, a smile at the neighbor's cat, an inside joke that no longer lands and therefore lands differently, and the film's seriousness is not solemnity, it's attention, which is not the same thing as heaviness, and that attention kept me awake to the small miracles of real love that flicker even when a relationship is dying, the way someone still sets a glass of water by someone else's side, the way someone takes the cooler side of the bed without needing to be asked, and to the more radical miracle of stepping away without turning your heart to stone. If we talk about the craft of narrative here, there's also a structural elegance I admired. The arc is not strictly three-act in the classical sense, it feels more like a quartet of movements. The first establishes the temperature, the second introduces the disturbance of the first love's return and the document that follows, the third is the distribution of consequences where both characters sit in the rooms they built and decide what to do with them, and the fourth is the hospital movement, where the music thins and a single instrument takes the melody and Oral signs. And though I'm describing it musically, the film itself is not musical in the overt sense, it's just that the rhythm of its unfolding made me think of how a good piece of music doesn't scream its themes, it invites them to repeat until meaning blooms in repetition, and this film repeats the image of open doors and cold tea, repeats the action of wiping a table, repeats the slight hunt for keys in a bowl by the door. And those repeats accumulate into something like memory itself. There's a delicate bravery in how the story handles the returning first love, who in many films would be the catalyst for rage, and here is the catalyst for clarity. The scenes involving John and that former flame are observed from such a distance that we are never entangled in their romance. If that's what it is, we are instead invited to see how a past that was never properly buried can intrude like a ghost, and the moral weight is not placed on them as individuals but on the failure to manage that ghost and the failure to speak aloud what is true when the wind changes. And that is why the film's most decisive action belongs to Oral, because she is the only one in the story who accepts the truth and moves from it rather than around it. And acceptance here is not a passive stance, it is a wakeful one, and I can't overstate how rare that is on screen. Some of you might be wondering if the film takes sides in terms of moral blame, whether it punishes John or sanctifies Oral, and I can say with relief that it does not. It recognizes that two truths can exist at once. John's confusion is real and deserves compassion, and Oral's pain is real and deserves action, and the relationship's ending is both a loss and a liberation. And to hold those truths in a single frame without grinding them into an easy lesson is an achievement in itself. The film also respects the idea that responsibility does not always mean villainy, that you can be responsible for harm without having intended it, and that the path forward isn't to shame but to decline to be harmed further. I think that's part of why the audience reaction was so steady and generous, because people do not feel accused by this film, they feel invited, and across contexts, this kind of invitation can change how we talk about our own lives. It can soften us towards each other in the very conversations that might otherwise become defensiveness duels. It can help a couple say the unglamorous truth, we cannot make it like this. Would you like to try a new way? And if the answer is no, then we bless each other on the way out. And I haven't forgotten the gaming audience many of you belong to on this channel. You might expect bombast in your media diet. You might come to cinema the way you come to a midnight boss fight, hungry for spectacle and the clean hit of victory. But Cinta Yang Tertahan offers a different kind of difficulty, a difficulty of presence, a test of whether you can stay with a feeling without button mashing your way past it. And yes, you will be rewarded with a boss defeat of a sort, but the boss is the story we tell ourselves when we cannot let ourselves be loved honestly, and the defeat isn't a knockout punch but the removal of armor piece by piece. There's one last thing I want to say about the hospital, because too many films make illness a cheap plot device, an engine that forcibly teaches characters what they should have already known, and here the hospital is treated with the gravity of a place where choices are clarified because life is clarified. Because when you hear machines count your heart's beats you remember that those beats are not infinite and that to spend them knotted in a cold room is its own kind of diminuendo, and if this image makes the film sound heavy, I promise it is also strangely light, not in the sense of froth but in the sense of a cloud passing and you feeling the warmth return to your skin, and that's why by the end, heartbreak becomes less a storm and more a weather report, a thing you work around, a thing you dress for, a thing that will not drown you because you already know how to swim. And that knowledge is quietly triumphant. The more I sit with Cinta Yang Tertahan, the more I discover that what it does best is give us a vocabulary for humane endings, endings that do not calcify into bitterness and do not alchemize into revisionist nostalgia, endings that make space for gratitude without gaslighting, that allow us to say thank you for the years and also I cannot do this anymore, and if art is, among other things, a rehearsal room for our real lives, then this film is a rehearsal worth having, a chance to practice the sentence many of us fear, this is not working, not because I am not worthy or you are not worthy, but because this relationship we built asks me to abandon myself, and I will not and you should not want me to, because the love we deserve consists of two selves intact and brave, not one self dimmed to keep the other warm. I'll land the plane here with a final reflection on why this movie matters in 2025, because over and over this year we've watched stories where the end is spectacle, where disaster is the only way to get anyone to listen, and then a film like this arrives and shows that attention can be won by whisper, that an ending can be drawn with a pen instead of an explosion and still be seismic, and if enough people internalize that lesson, maybe our own lives get a little saner, maybe we stop waiting for crises to give ourselves permission to act, and maybe we also learn to stay when staying is deserved, to warm each other with consistency, to treat love as a practice not a quiz, and most of all to hear the sound of our own lives telling us the truth when a document slides across a table or when a hand stays rigid when you reach for it. I'm not asking you to love Cinta Yang Tertahan the way I did, but I am asking you to give it the same respect it gives you, to meet it with your attention and let it meet you, to allow yourself the risk of feeling old pains stirred and then eased, and if you do that, I suspect like me you'll carry the film for weeks. You'll notice the way you pour tea, you'll watch the rain with different eyes, you'll say I love you in a tone that rings truer, and you'll remember, maybe most radically of all, that sometimes the bravest move in love is the tenderness of goodbye, and that tenderness can be the exact opposite of failure, it can be the proof of love itself. And if you've made it this far in this review, I hope you'll drop a comment so I can hear where you are watching from and what parts of your own story this film touched, because in listening to each other carefully we do the very thing this film asks of its characters. We show up, we face each other, we say the truest things we can bear, and we promise to warm each other not with an impossible sun but with small, steady fire. We keep moving because the story keeps breathing, and in the afterglow of that hospital room I find myself wanting to sit with the day after, the film's quietest triumph, where Oral wakes to a room that looks the same but doesn't feel the same, the air a touch lighter, the bed a touch wider, the window suddenly honest about the weather it's been trying to keep out, and there's a wordless inventory that happens here, the kind you do in your own life after a choice. You run your eyes over objects that once held a meaning and you notice the charge shifting, the mug that used to feel like Sunday now just feels like ceramic, the frame that was a shrine now a rectangle, and the movie trusts us to do that math without guiding our hand. No swelling score, no montage screaming new beginnings, just the vital rotation of the planet continuing as Oral takes a breath with her own name in it, maybe for the first time in 3 years. And the thing I admire is how the film resists the moral. A fresh starts as confetti, because anyone who's left knows that even a right decision can sting like cold air hitting a raw lung, and the camera waits with her through that first coffee as if holding her hand and letting her decide whether to drink it hot, and meanwhile John is elsewhere, and the film gives him the dignity of elsewhere, not a villain's lair, not a redemption arc soundtracked by guilt, but rooms with their own air where his silence can finally be heard by him, and if we're honest, that's the only place change ever starts, not in apology speeches but in the quiet where your patterns echo and you can't pretend the sound is coming from someone else. And while he sits in that sound the movie doesn't exonerate, it just observes, which is the mercy of good art. It lets consequence and compassion coexist in the same frame. On a second pass I found new tenderness in the way the film handles the outward ripple of the divorce, the people who need to be told, the little disclosures like stones skipping across a lake, family who answer with worry and loyalty in confusing ratios, friends who think advice is love and friends who know listening is love. The aunt who calls and tries to anchor Oral to the old continent of endurance with soft words and a harder subtext and then breathes differently when she hears Oral's steady tone. And you can tell in the short silence that follows that a generational weather front just passed between them, not a full thaw, but a change in wind, and these microshifts are where the film earns its resonance beyond the pair at its center, because it acknowledges how an intimate choice is never just a private whisper in our communities, it hums in the wires and the prayer rooms and the tea houses, and everyone has an opinion but only a few have skin in the game, and the movie keeps its eye on those few, never exploiting the chorus. If I let myself geek out on the filmmaking a bit more, because love is in the craft too. There's a patience to the shot scale that I can't praise enough, refusal to chase facial close-ups like clout, instead holding on wider frames and letting bodies tell the story. The space between shoulders a thesis, the way a sofa cushion indents and doesn't rebound fast enough an elegy, and then, when close-ups come, they feel earned, like a key finally turning in a lock, and the editor's grace is to arrive a heartbeat late rather than early, deferring gratification until you are actually hungry for the face, and this discipline is what gives the film its addictive gentleness, because you realize how starved you are for art that trusts you to find the center without neon arrows. The score continues to behave like a companion rather than a narrator, those faint strings that don't draw a line under anyone's choices but sit beside them, and I swear there's a single piano motif that only repeats when a character is telling themselves the truth, and if you listen close you'll hear it. Like a friend clearing their throat before saying the thing you've been waiting to hear them say, and often the film chooses silence instead, the kind where you become hyper-aware of everything, the kettle, the scooter passing, the neighbor's broom, and in that sharpened hearing you recognize your own house and heart, and that's the alchemy the movie performs on re-watch. It makes your empathy more precise. While we're here, that motif of doors and thresholds I keep returning to isn't just visual feng shui, it's moral geography. I keep replaying the moment John pauses on the verge of a conversation that could change everything, his palm on the jam like he's waiting for the wood to give him permission, and then stepping away. And across the room Oral's shoulders do a small lift that says I cannot beg for you to enter anymore, and the camera, respectful as always, refuses to chase him through the door. It keeps us with her, Because this is her story even if it's about them, and the ethics of a camera that doesn't abandon a woman's point of view the minute a man decides to move is something I wish we saw more often. I also want to talk about hands because this is a film where hands speak plain, Oral's hands setting cutlery that have the softness of someone who knows where every fork belongs, John's hands in pockets as if guarding against spillage, the nurse's hands adjusting a pillow with the kind of competence that lets suffering breathe, and on a deeper red those hands become the movie's chorus about labor, whose hands do the maintenance of love, whose hands learn to mend and whose learn to clench, and a tiny detail that broke me was Oral tightening a screw on a loose cabinet door alone, not because she can't call someone, but because she has, all this time, and this time she doesn't, and the sound of that screw cutting new bite into wood becomes a different kind of vow. For those of you who asked about the first love scenes, the film remains delicately disinterested in their romance as romance, refusing to sensationalize or to offer that character as a lifeboat, and in that refusal is its integrity, because the clarity this person brings isn't about a second chance at an old story, it's about refusing to weaponize nostalgia to anesthetize the present, and when the two of them do share a frame it's full of glass and reflection rather than heat, which isn't coldness. It's the movie's way of telling you that memory should be looked through, not lived in, and their conversations have the grace of survivors of a shipwreck who meet years later and give each other the gift of naming what they survived without trying to build a new boat out of driftwood. Some of the audience commentary online has pushed me to articulate this too. The film is not anti-marriage, it's anti-stasis. It doesn't argue for leaving as virtue, it argues against abandoning yourself as method. And that difference matters because it makes the movie an ally to couples who want to try differently, not a cheerleader for quick exits. And I've heard from people who watched it and then finally made an appointment for counseling, and when the bar blinks and goes red we call ourselves failures instead of adjusting the build, and Cinta young tertahan is that friend who says hey, you're carrying too much, and there is no perk for martyrdom in this game, just exhaustion, and if the other player won't co-op, you're gated, you cannot open that door, so find another path, and it says it without contempt, which is why it works. Back to the visuals, because color is character here. Oral's wardrobe nudges from pastels to earth grounding rather than brightening, and the home's palette warms in strange places and cools where comfort used to live, and you might not clock the shift consciously until a scene where she stands in a pool of natural light that doesn't flatter so much as clarify the edges of a person reclaimed, and if that sounds romanticized, the film keeps it practical by showing her doing ordinary work under that light, answering emails, washing a pan, texting a friend, which is how real reclamation looks. Less like a victory dance and more like the 1,000 small motions of a day done without bracing. I've been thinking too about the legal document as character, and it's not just a clever device, it's a stand-in for how bureaucracy mediates our most intimate choices, and the film lets that be unsettling without turning it into a rant, this awareness that sometimes your freedom requires a stamp, which carries an odd sadness with it, and the camera lingers on the edges of the paper enough that you can see the fibers and feel how absurd it is that love is exiting through a rectangle, which is part of the film's genius, to honor the absurdity without denying the utility. If this is beginning to sound like I'm excavating a text for symbolism, let me pull it back into the chest for a second, because the guts of this piece are Oral's voice morphing from accommodation to self-possession, a subtle migration in tone that the actor achieves without lecture. You feel it in her pauses and the way apology syllables drop from her sentences over time. And that's not a call to arrogance, it's a call to accuracy. She stops apologizing for taking up rightful space, and when she says no in the final third, it arrives with that astounding softness that only the sure have, and you realize this is what a boundary sounds like when it isn't revenge, and that sound might be the thing that haunts you after. Like the lingering key of a song you didn't know you needed, does the film tell us what happens to John next, beyond the immediate? It hints without hand-holding. A shot of him sitting at a table with a blank page and a pen, which could be anything, a letter, an apology he will send or won't, a list of groceries for a life he will now have to learn to feed for himself. And the mercy is that the film doesn't assign hope or doom to that image, it respects the fact that the future is a room you walk into alone, and in that respect is its refusal to punish or to save, only to witness, and in a media landscape that loves orphans of villainy and saints of pain, this balance feels like a small revolution. It's worth mentioning a late scene that I don't think I gave enough light to before, the conversation between Oral and the neighbor who has been watering her plants when she's late. 2 sentences each and an exchange of a small cutting from a thriving pot, and I understand on the second pass that this is the film's most explicit metaphor for what support looks like. not rescue, not lecture, not alliance pledging. Performance, just the handing over of something alive that will continue to grow if tended, and that's the kind of friendship the movie suggests we should all aspire to give and to ask for, and in that seed is the possibility of a post-divorce world that isn't a wasteland but a greenhouse, and it's funny to say that about a film so quiet but it's true, the aftermath here is fecund, not in the sense of rushing to new romance but in the sense of building soil. The cultural reception keeps rippling too, and I've spoken to viewers in Jakarta and Surabaya and Singapore and beyond who have never seen a hospital bed signature staged with such dignity, not as a melodramatic cliff's edge but as a grounded ritual, and what has surprised me is how many men have written me to say they felt seen in John's inability to name his hunger, which can be the first step toward learning to speak without relying on a partner to translate your silence into care, and if the film manages anything beyond its runtime it might be this. A nudge to have the conversation before the paper arrives, to say I'm cold or I'm scared or I'm still tied to a ghost and I don't know how to untie without burning the house down, and to hear in return not scorn but an honest we can try or an honest we cannot, and either way to proceed in the light, in case you're wondering if we ever get the catharsis of confrontation. The movie refuses the shouting match and is stronger for it, because it trades the sugar high of a scene you can clip for the slow nutrition of behavior. You watch John finally attempt to say something true and you watch Aurel's face when she realizes it is true and it is too late for them, and both those things can be real in the same breath, and they are, and the film lets the moment exhale without fixing it, which requires a discipline many storytellers lack and many viewers have been waiting to see, and it stands as a kind of teaching we can take into our own lives. Late truth is better than none, but it doesn't demand the old relationship's resurrection to have worth. The last thread I'll pull on here is the one that connects this story to the larger question the year seems to be asking us in film after film. What does care look like when the mythologies we inherited start to wobble? And Cinta young Tertahan answers not with a manifesto but with a series of rooms. And in each room someone chooses between frictionless harmony and hard honesty, and the film has the audacity to tell you that harmony is overrated when it is purchased with silencing, and honesty is not cruelty when it is delivered with steadiness, and if that sounds like something your grandmother might have said and something your therapist might have said, that's because the oldest wisdoms are meeting the newest vocabularies here, and the result is a story that can belong to both, a bridge you can walk in either direction depending on what you need tonight, and so yes, I remain moved, not because the film invented a new way to break hearts but because it remembered the old way of telling the truth softly enough that people can face it. And if you're watching this or listening to this review as you make dinner or ride the bus or lie awake, I hope you let a little of that softness into your own head tonight. I hope you ask yourself the brave question without panic, and I hope you answer yourself without cruelty, and if that leads you to stay, bless you, and if it leads you to go, bless you twice, because walking away from an altar built on your own diminishing is an act of devotion to the life you've been given, and if that sounds like praise. The film is telling us about love withheld, about marriage as a temperature map, about the way two people can orbit the same bed and never touch, and even more about the way courage sometimes looks like sliding a pen across paper and writing your name in order to rescue your own pulse. To deepen that, I want to re-enter the opening stretches, the long early sequences where Aurel moves through her life like someone practicing trust one ordinary act at a time, because this is how the film builds its moral weather, not with speeches or sudden storms but with repetitions, the folded laundry, the bowls set just so, the small notes left near the sink that are less requests than prayers, and what's remarkable is how the movie lets these rituals be both sacred and suffocating, gentle in their intention and ruthless in their effect, because a ritual without response becomes a monologue, and if there's a wound the film keeps touching, it's that Aurel has been talking to a kind of snow, a slow, quiet snow that doesn't melt from effort or kindness or the warmth of good meals, and that snow is John's interior distance, not a cartoon cruelty, not an obvious villainy, just a calm that has calcified, a habit of not entering the room fully, and the director knows that this is the heartbreak most of us fear most because you can't point to it easily, you can't say here is the bruise, here is the shout, you only have the absence, and absence is hard to prove if the person is technically present, smiling sometimes, paying the bills, taking the trash out, doing all the things that check a box while withholding the thing the boxes are supposed to stand for. And that's the haunting the film renders with almost surgical clarity. It's one thing to be left, it's another to be slowly left in place, to be outlived by another person's silence while sitting across a table from them. And so when the first love enters like a small wave of memory wearing a new body, the film is careful and wise here. What's important isn't the other person's glamour, It's the way their presence acts like an X-ray, revealing what's been true the whole time, that John maintained a door ajar in his chest for an earlier version of himself, a door that Oral has been trying to close with her warmth alone. And that's not a flaw unique to John, it's a pattern as old as regret, a pattern as common as nostalgia. But the movie doesn't forgive it just because it's common. It asks, what is the cost, and who pays it? And then we watch Oral count the receipts quietly, not because she's feeble or naive, but because she needed to know she tried, she needed to respect the part of her that doesn't quit quickly. And this is how the film keeps us out of easy morality and inside the harder work of looking. What I notice more watching it in my mind a second time is how costuming whispers these truths too. Oral's clothing gradually drifting from soft colors that feel like daylight to tones that carry a dusk, not a dive into gloom but a shading that signals she's recalibrating. She's not dressing for hope alone anymore, she's dressing for clarity, while John's palette holds steady, like a man whose wardrobe is an alibi, whose consistency is meant to convince you he is steady, okay, reliable. And what emerges from this visual thesis is a quiet indictment of the ways we equate sameness with safety, when in truth some sameness is just an illness disguised as virtue, an inability to meet the person across from you where they have come to stand. And that's where the threads of culture are woven in without the film kneeling at the altar of exposition, the way it honors the social gravity of marriage in the communities it depicts. There's the neighbor's nod, the aunt's call, the gentle pressure of tradition humming in the air, unspoken but felt, and yet it refuses to make those pressures the villain either, because nothing in this movie is that simple. Everything is a gradient, which is more honest to life than the binaries we are often sold. That's why when the Surat Sarai lands, that sheet of paper with its clinical language, it doesn't arrive as a twist, it arrives as a naming, it arrives as a label for a container that had already emptied out, and the hard thing is watching how that document asks different questions of each person. To John it asks a question about identity and pride and narrative, the fear of being the one who failed at forever, the fear of being judged by a community that equates endurance with virtue, and to Oral it asks a question about selfhood and integrity, the fear of being named the quitter and the deeper fear of not quitting a slow erasure. And if you sense that I am, in this second dive, looping more intently around the psychological than the plot, you're sensing the film's own design, because the heart of it isn't what happens, it's what people allow to happen and, crucially, what they refuse to allow any longer. It's here that I want to talk about the camera's compassion, the way the cinematography refuses to catch anyone uglily, even when they're being unkind, the way it makes room for everyone to look human through every mistake, which means we don't get the high of righteous outrage, we get something both more difficult and more maturing, the ethics of paying attention to complexity. And if you think that sounds cerebral, the movie avoids dryness by rooting that ethic in texture, the cold of tile underfoot, the weight of keys in a dish that might as well be a bell rung each time someone leaves or returns, the feel of rain on forearms when you reach out to check if the storm is really blowing as hard as it looks, and the steady beep of hospital monitors that measure not just Oral's heartbeat but the story's understanding that the body bears the burden of our emotional labor. That's why the hospital isn't a plot trick, it's a thesis made flesh, a visual argument that you can only pour so much of yourself into. Holding a relationship together before your body charges you interest, and in those clinical blues and whites, the signature becomes a ritual of release instead of a surrender to despair, a moment where Oral's voice, kept so soft for so long, finds an unshakable tone without needing volume, and the pen becomes both a scalpel and a salve, cutting clean and easing pain. When I re-witness that scene in my mind I notice again how the film protects Oral from spectacle. There's no violin slicing the air into emotional neon, no dramatic dolly in to pull a single tear into a billboard, just the room, the machine, the nurse whose face understands that she is present at a sacrament, the kind of sacrament we don't have rituals for outside of film, the ceremony of choosing yourself when choosing yourself has been cast as selfishness your entire life, and that's why the smaller moments around it hum with such vibrational power. The way a friend sits lightly on the edge of a chair, not overstepping, the way a doctor asks a question with an angle of tone that respects dignity, the way the bed linen folds like a quiet wave. If this makes the film sound unbearably serious, you should know it's also attentive to the quicksilver of humor that lives in even the heaviest rooms, a micro smile when two people mishear each other and nothing breaks, a shared memory that momentarily rearranges the furniture of the present and lets a tiny shaft of light fall in, humor as pressure valve, never as mockery. And that same ethos informs the depiction of the first love's return, which refuses to be either fantasy or threat. refuses to let the audience turn that figure into a scapegoat or a savior, and instead insists that what the presence does is simply show the edges of the map more clearly. A map John refused to redraw when the terrain changed. And maybe if I'm stretching the gaming metaphor for this channel, it's here that the movie reveals its difficulty setting, because it's not a boss fight where you can roll dodge and parry until the health bar depletes. It's a resource management sim where your primary resource is honesty and your secondary resource is patience, and you cannot grind your way to enough of either if the other person refuses to collect with you. And the game's map doesn't open until both players stand on the pressure plates together, which means Oral has been standing on her plate alone until her legs went numb, and what she does in the hospital is step off and discover the floor is her friend again. I'm lingering here because performances matter most where scripts ask actors to speak in small gestures, and in this film the acting is a tapestry woven from the fine thread of micromotions. Oral's way of deferring eye contact just enough to preserve her interior privacy without building an extra wall, John's habit of choosing a corner of a room that allows him a line of sight that passes just to the side of the person he loves, the way their hands find work when conversation inches into the real, and the way those hands go still when truth arrives at last. And that sudden stillness is where you feel the film place a hand on your shoulder and ask you to look and not turn away. It's this respect for smallness that shapes the pace as well. The way long takes allow emotional math to resolve in real time, the way silence is not dead air but a bridge, and if you test your patience against it you might at first fidget, which is fine. That's your nervous system trained by a decade of content designed to cheat you out of your attention. But if you breathe instead, the film rewards you with the sensation of actually having time. Time to feel the contours of a felt truth. Time to notice the tiny moment Oral's face moves from composure to conviction. Time to watch John's jaw argue with his heart and lose. When we talk cultural impact, I want to be more specific now, because the film's conversation with Southeast Asian realities of marriage is neither scolding nor naive. It understands the weight of families and the architecture of expectation that makes leaving a kind of community disruption, and it also understands that the community is changing. That children raised on the vocabulary of boundaries and mental health have begun to ask questions their parents never asked, questions about how endurance can shelter harm. And one of the quiet powers of Cinta tertahan is how it offers a picture of leaving that is both respectful and undeniable, allowing viewers who have been waiting for a soft permission to feel seen, and allowing viewers who have been holding on because they are afraid of being labeled selfish to imagine a different language for self-respect. And the online discourse I watched spin up after the film's first weekend bore this out, not in hot take pyrotechnics but in an array of thoughtful threads, some in Baisa, some in English, often braided with personal testimonies that kept returning to everyday artifacts, the bowl, the keys, the paper, and how those objects had become symbols in viewers' own homes. I saw fathers writing about wanting to do better than John, not with flinching shame but with a forward-looking humility. I saw mothers writing about how proud they were that their daughters could say no earlier than they did. I saw men defending John as someone wounded by a culture that starved them of tender literacy, and I saw women insisting that the wounded do not have the right to wound indefinitely. And the film held space for both and asked only that we aim our empathy without letting it dismantle our edges, which is a rare thing and why I keep saying the movie felt like an intervention in the best sense. A thing that asks us to tell the truth to ourselves before it asks us to tell it to each other. While I'm here, I want to credit the way sound design behaves like a second script, the click of a door that is a little too loud because suddenly the departure is a character, the shift of cutlery on ceramic plates that achieves the same effect as an orchestra's string section when someone says a sentence that isn't quite an apology, the ambient hum of a city that feels like a heartbeat in another room, and of course those hospital beeps, which arrive in the film like measure marks, letting you feel what we rarely let ourselves feel. That time isn't only running forward, it is counting, and each count is a choice, so signing isn't just a legal act but a reclaiming of how the counts will be spent, and this felt to me not melodramatic but merciful, because mercy sometimes looks like closing a door before everybody inside freezes. If you're the kind of viewer who loves cinematic genealogy, you might be tempted to point to International Cousins, the hush of scenes from a marriage, the open nerve of Blue Valentine, the courtroom ethics moving through a separation. But I would argue that Cinta tertahan isn't an echo, it's a neighbor, shaped by its own street sounds and kitchen smells, its own prayers and passings and public norms, and while it shares with those films the belief that ordinary expression is enough to hold extraordinary feeling, it also feels distinct in how it threads family and faith as subtle pressure, always present, rarely named, like a gravity field you can't see but have to learn to navigate. And this is crucial because it keeps the film from becoming a treatise and leaves it a story, which is why it lands in the body first, in the inhale and exhale, not the brow furrow. And I can't shake how much I love the way it uses doors and thresholds as staging. We touched it before, but new angles appear when you revisit it. A sequence where a half-closed door frames Aural's face as she listens to nothing in particular. A shot where John pauses with a hand on the jam as if the wood could teach him how to pause courageously instead of avoid. And in that choreography of entrances and exits, the film writes the emotional geometry of living with someone whose fear keeps rerouting intimacy around the same cul-de-sacs. And then there are windows, always windows, not as cliched but as practical rectangles of light where decisions look different depending on the time of day. And I can't help but think that the repeated rain we see has on purpose no montage of cathartic play. Because this movie refuses to turn weather into therapy, it lets weather be a condition like all the others, a thing you adjust to while you do the harder work of telling the truth to yourself. Some of you asked me in messages what exactly the movie suggests Aural should have done earlier, and I think that's the wrong question because the film isn't giving us advice disguised as art, it's showing us a person arriving at a naming in her own time, honoring the dignity of her trajectory. And if you want to translate that into your own life, maybe the lesson is just this: you are allowed to re-evaluate your promises when new information arrives, and the new information can sometimes be nothing more than the old information finally spoken aloud, and nothing about that is betrayal, it is maturity. And if that sounds liberating, that's because the film wants it to, but it also wants to tell you that liberation costs. It costs comfort and certainty and a story about yourself that may have been holding you up, and it's okay to grieve that as you reach for something more honest. And yes, this is still a review as much as a meditation, so I'll keep a pulse on craft because craft is the body language of story, and in that language Cinta young Tertahan speaks fluently, with lenses that favor human scale, with frames that breathe, with edits that feel like negotiation rather than cuts, with a score that trusts your sensitivity and never patronizes it, with performances that recognize that the face is a landscape and the eyes a weather report, and with direction that keeps choosing care over cleverness even when cleverness would have been easier to show off, which is why by the end you don't feel impressed so much as companioned. You don't say what a smart film but what a kind film, even though its kindness hurts because that's what truth often feels like before it heals. Let me tell you also about the way the movie uses food, not as fetish but as relational index, the spoon that clinks because it has to when no one is talking, the rice steamed to the exact comfort of someone's memory as a way of proposing a truce, the tea that goes cold when someone breaks a promise, and the quiet domestic tragedy of pouring it down the sink, not because it's wasteful but because a small hope has become undrinkable. And sharing this felt so intimate on screen that I felt like I should look away and then stayed because complicit attention is part of the film's ask. It's training you in the ethics of staying present to what people actually do instead of what they say they do. And the interplay between Aural and the unnamed first love is a study in ethical depiction too. You are never invited to root for their reunion as if that would solve what the marriage cannot, nor are you invited to despise them as a temptation. You are invited to see them as a test of John's honesty with himself, a mirror he has avoided, and in that mirror watch a person decide to keep hiding or not. And the tragedy is that his decision doesn't come fast enough to avoid harming someone he cares about, which is often the shape of human lessons, late, tender, and costly. It bears saying as well that the film's courage lies not only in honoring Aural's exit but in granting John the possibility of learning without rewarding him with a neat redemption, which in another movie could have been the false balm we're given to avoid the discomfort of inconclusiveness, but here the inconclusive is what allows the film to be honest, because people don't transform on our schedules, they transform on theirs, if they do at all. And the person who has been holding the room's warmth isn't required to freeze while she waits. I realize too that I haven't spoken enough about the bodies on screen beyond faces, and this is part of the film's choreography that matters, because so much of relational truth shows up below the neck. The way Aural's shoulders lift before certain conversations, making her smaller as if preemptive bracing were a survival mechanism. The way John's spine straightens in defensiveness not because he intends harm but because his entire education taught him to equate vulnerability with exposure and exposure with danger. And the film doesn't punish the body for these learned reflexes, it just shows them so we can see ourselves and maybe be a little less automatic next time in our own kitchens and halls. And speaking of halls, do you remember the sound of slippers I talked about earlier, the shuffle that becomes a metronome of absence? On second pass it's even more pronounced, even more like a backbeat the film relies on, because there's something about the domestic that turns into percussion if you pay attention. the drips and the clinks and the doors and the steps, and in that music I hear the score of a love that could be if tended to, which makes it all the more devastating when we realize attention alone cannot make living rooms into lifeboats. It needs mutuality, and that's the other word this film is an essay about without ever once using, mutuality, the way love is a science of moving forward together at the same rate. And if you're reading this as an indictment of any one person, you'll miss the tender grief the movie extends to the entire idea of trying. It never mocks trying, it just refuses to confuse trying with thriving. It might be tempting to ask too whether the hospital decision would have landed as hard if the rest of the film hadn't laid the ground, and the answer is no, of course not, because a document in a vacuum is just paper and a pen, but a document in a life is a weather event, and the film knows this and gifts us the meteorology of that moment, the isobars of memory pressing in, the warm front of relief moving across the cold of endurance, the wind lines of new possibility beginning to twist toward the horizon, and in that forecast there is not gloating, only steadiness, and perhaps even a quiet sense of sorrow for wasted time, not the kind that keeps you stuck, the kind that gets folded into a thank you and a goodbye. I want to spend a minute on the idea of forgiveness too, because it runs beneath the film like a river you can't always see but you hear if you're quiet. Oral's forgiveness is not a ticket to continued harm, it's a way of refusing to carry poison into her next season, and the film models this maturely by letting her release be clean, not performative, no public humiliations, no scorched earth, which doesn't mean she doesn't feel rage, it just means the rage is metabolized into boundary rather than spectacle, and that is such a necessary picture for audiences raised on breakups as messy entertainment. And as for John, the film allows him the kind of forgiveness that takes the form of being let go, the kind that allows his future to be possible without insisting on making Oral part of it, and that too is a mercy. And if that strikes you as too soft, I'd ask what you think the alternative accomplishes aside from a drama spike and a worse hangover. If I zoom back out to the idea of cinema time, the length of the film and the density of its quiet, I think of how unusual it is for a story to maintain this level of emotional voltage without explosions or reveal drops, and the voltage comes from connection, from the electric of being seen by a piece of art that doesn't want to sell you a lesson, just a mirror, and the mirror this one sells is polished with empathy. Forgive me, this movie has me devotional, but only toward patience, and only toward clarity. I have more, always more, because this story, like the rooms it moves through, reveals new corners every time the light shifts. So if you want me to keep turning the angles, talk about the casual brilliance of the film's closing image, the quiet choreography of telling colleagues, the almost dance-like politeness of dividing books, the way the city noise sharpens then softens as Oral learns to walk with less armor, I'm here, and I'll keep us in the pocket of that hush the film taught us to value, asking you with the same care the movie asked its characters to ask themselves. People who watched it and finally admitted that they have been using counseling as a stall tactic for a departure they know is right, which tells me the film isn't prescribing, it's describing with enough honesty that you can hear your own life echoing in it, and then decide. Now, to the gaming minds among us, the metaphor that emerged on this second tour is stamina bars, how the best titles teach you to read your character's limits and pace your play, and in relationships, we burn stamina pretending to be someone's entire weather, running a sun we don't have fuel for,